You can't be a follower of Jesus Christ and say, I know what you said, Jesus, but I prefer to believe, but that's kind of where we are.
Yeah. Do we have to disclose identities in this podcast?
We don't have to.
Oh.
Relationship is never built in rows. So in the auditorium, it's set not to build relationship.
Right.
Relationship is built around the table.
Yeah. He starts walking toward me, and I said, our church does these cookies just to show you God's love and welcome you to the community. And he said, what did you say? I said, well, our church, and before I even finished, he collapsed on the ground sobbing. And I said, what's going on? And he said, I have a gun over there. And I was about to kill myself. And I was sitting here praying, God, if there's another way, send me a sign. And so I sat there with this man for quite a while until his family and stuff got there. And he just kept saying, he heard me, he answered me.
Frankly, we've got a lot of lukewarm people in our churches.
I mean, I beg God to take the desire to pastor away.
One of my favorite Hendrix quotes, Howard Hendrix, is, not Jimmy, you can impress somebody at a distance, but you can only impact them up close.
God can handle the big questions.
Hi, I'm Chris McNeil, and this is Ministry on the Move, a journey podcast interviewing pastors and ministers across the country. As the father of the McNeils, I get to travel all across this land singing the gospel, and one day it dawned on me that I was already having great conversations with pastors. And then came the conviction that maybe I should hit the record button and share these inspiring, insightful, and hopeful conversations with you. Join me on a journey to churches of all shapes and sizes, different parts of the country, and see just what it takes to shepherd the body of Christ. For more information on the McNeils, you can visit us at mcneilmusic.tv or mcneilmusic.com, or follow us on Facebook at The McNeils with 2 L's. Thanks for joining us, and here's the show. Hey everybody, thanks so much for listening. I'm Chris. This was a fun trip. We, as it stands at the release of this podcast, we will have we've completed the beginning process of our 8th album in Nashville, and we've got the backtracks, the band, recorded, and 13 songs, and we're going back in a couple of weeks to do the vocals. And when we left Nashville in May, we turned our attention to the north and we headed to Michigan. And this is the first of a 2-part series with Josh Corbin, who is the youngest pastor that I've interviewed so far. 2-part series. He's getting his doctorate, and so we had lots of things to talk about. It's really, really a fun conversation. If you're enjoying this, it would really help us out a great deal if you could take the time to give us a like, a thumbs up, write a review, especially for those of you who are listening to us on iTunes or anywhere, wherever you're listening to it. If you could give us a review, a thumbs up, a like, share it with your friends, help us get the word out. That would do so much if you're enjoying it, and would love to hear back from you. Tell me where you're listening from, what you want to hear me ask of pastors. And this is the first of a 2-part series with Josh Corbin. This is Chris McNeil, Ministry on the Move. I don't know what episode this is going to be. Probably episode 15. I suspect that my one with John Gators went long. I think that was going to wind up being 3. However, I do know that I've got Josh Corbin, who is the pastor of North Flushing Baptist Church in Flushing, Michigan. And the McNeils, we just finished a concert there this evening, and Josh has been gracious enough to wander into this minefield with me and my ramblings. And so, Josh, thanks for taking a chance and coming and being part of this.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah. So you, right off the bat, you are the youngest pastor that I've interviewed by 2 years. You're 29?
I'm 29. Or at the end of the year, I'll finally be old enough to be a pastor at 30. So,
yeah. And how long have you been the pastor here? I think you said 22.
Yeah, January of 2022. We came, and there was probably, I don't know, we're at 60 on a Sunday morning. And the Lord has grown that to where we're probably running 120-ish or so on a Sunday morning now. And God's really blessed that and grown that. He's brought a lot of unity to our church. I would say COVID really hit this church hard, where they were probably running, 250 or so prior to that. And for whatever reason, it just diminished. And so God graciously allowed us to be up here and to serve in this capacity, which we're very grateful for. And he's just been the one doing the work. It's not been anything special about us. He's been bringing people. If people get saved, it's not because I did something spectacular. It's just they'll say, well, I need to get saved, which is their own realization. It's not us pushing something. So
it's a great facility. So were you a pastor before COVID?
No, I was finishing seminary. So I went down and I was at Pensacola Christian in Pensacola, Florida. So my background growing up was very strong, independent, fundamental Baptist.
Right.
And I would say the Lord has brought a lot of balance to that, where I tend to be more now the person who wants to get along with people who disagree with me. I want to understand why they disagree with me. I might not fall in the same conviction that they do at the end of the day.
Right.
But if we agree on the gospel, then there's no reason to be enemies. We have enough enemies in the world as
Out
it is.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's no reason for the church to fight each other, which is why Christ wisely says a house divided against itself cannot stand. And I think you see that at least over the past probably 70 or 80 years in America specifically, where Christians wanted to split over everything. That's why I often say the way that Baptists do math is they multiply by division.
Right.
And so, it's just the nature of how people are. They want to split over every little thing instead of allowing the Lord to be the Lord of the conscience. They want to be the Lord of everyone's conscience. And it causes division in the church when, if they would be gracious and receive one another as Christ has received them, which is what Romans 14 says, then there would be no reason for disunity in a church. Because God is the Lord of the conscience. We don't have to be God's voice in everyone's life. God does that on his own and does a very good job at it. I mean, he has used creation to spread into all the world that he is the creator, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork, right? Every day they utter their speech. There's no language where their voice is not heard. God is a good enough communicator on his own about what his desire is. Now, he's chosen us to be his gospel bearers. We should be grateful for that. But by the same token, we don't have to be everyone's conscience. And you see that in Matthew 7 as well, even growing up conservative. It's funny because, of course, Jesus says there, judge not, lest you be judged. And people would take that and say, well, later on he says it's okay to judge. Well, the command there actually in the passage is don't judge. The other part is not the command. In fact, that's why he deals with the speck of sawdust in someone's eye and the beams that are in your own eye, because it's the people who are being hypercritical over the smallest things. And unfortunately, I think that's what you see in a lot of churches anymore, where people, instead of having their focus on Christ, which would make everything else blur out, they wouldn't notice it. I often use the exit sign in the back of our auditorium as an example, right? If I'm focused on that, you're just a blur to me. And I don't notice everything about you. I know you're there, but I don't notice all the detail because I'm focused on that. So if I'm focused on Christ, everything else becomes a blur. Not that we don't address sin. Like, obviously, you still have to address sin in a church, but I don't notice all the little things. And that would be a great thing for churches to be able to grasp onto, is stop focusing on the little things in each other's lives and instead focus on Christ and care about the unity of the body, and the body would be strong. And you wouldn't see Christianity diminishing as much, because instead of fighting Satan, who we're told to go and attack his gates, instead we're on the retreat because we're too busy shooting ourselves.
Right, shooting our wounded.
Yeah,
I've told people forever that I make a terrible judge and an even worse God.
Yeah.
And I know because I've tried both.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, as young as you are, you grew up in the church, you said. Mm-hmm. So normally I save this question for much later in the discussion, but you just kind of walked me into it. So I'm interested. As a young person, so growing up, my generation, and I'm old enough to be your dad. You're just a year older than my oldest. So my generation was defined by what I lovingly call the music wars. Mm-hmm. And we determined whether someone was going to go in through the pearly gates based on whether or not rock and roll was accepted in the church or not. Mm-hmm. And that I say that tongue in cheek, but the music wars were a real thing, and in large part, I think it defined my generation, the 80s, 90s, early aughts, how music was going to be done. And shout out to Justin Gatlin, and I am reading the book you gave me, Justin, Why Johnny Can't Sing the Hymns. I'm about halfway through it, and it's an interesting read. Same vein. So let me ask you this. What do you perceive your generation will be defined by in the church? What are the things that you guys see? Are you familiar with the art? So let's do Solomon's carriage. So the idea is Solomon had this carriage, and it says that he had 10 men in front of him, 10 men on his wings, and 10 men behind him. And the idea is that the 10 men in front were, in the analogy, they're older. Mm-hmm. The ones on the wings are his peers, and then the ones coming behind are the next generation. That's sort of the analogy that I'm trying to use. And as you look at, and the ones behind you in particular, mm-hmm. are the ones that see your blind spots.
Yeah.
Right? So you are in a great position to see my generation's blind spots. And so I'm asking, what do you, and at the end of the day, if your generation looks at our blind spots and we, the older generation, God, that sounds so bad, but I am, the older generation says, oh, I didn't see that. Thank you. Well, then there's, we tear down the idols, mm-hmm. and there's a celebration. Yeah. And then the cycle repeats, because you'll have a blind spot at some point, mm-hmm. presumably. Let's start with, do you see blind spots in the existing generation?
Yeah, I think there's a blind spot in the sense that my generation feels like they can't have church unless people are their age. There seems to be, and this is friends from college, this is just by our own observation, if there are not people their age, they won't go and say, well, there's no one my age. And that blind spot has caused them to say, well, I'm just not going to go to church. I'm not going to be part of the church because there's no one my age. And it's ironic because you never see that as a good thing in the Bible to be around people your age.
Right.
You see that as those people are just as stupid as you are. So maybe go find someone older. I tell our church all the time that you met Dave Simpson tonight. He's mm-hmm. 87.
Yeah. He doesn't look it. Oh my goodness, yeah. The man looks fantastic for 87.
He cut down an oak tree last year. He's on his roof all the time. The man grew up as a farm boy. Uh-huh. I mean, he is
honest living,
very healthy. Yeah. Worked at IBM for years, in its glory days. Not what it is now, I guess. Right. But yeah, just the way that all worked out is just a man of wisdom, loves the Lord, very faithful in his life. All his kids love the Lord. And for me, I've attached myself to him because he's essentially the person I go to for advice. He's the person who is honest with me about things that he might see or perceive in my life. But you go to most people in my generation, they don't want anything to do with old people because they feel like, well, I need to be with someone who's at my stage in life. In fact, you'll see that with churches. They'll say, well, we have stuff for your stage in life. And I'm not saying that that's wrong to be around people that are at similar stages. That can be helpful in a sense. Maybe your kids can play with other kids, things like that. However, the bill of lies my generation has been sold is you must be around people your age. And that starts from when we go to school. Right. I mean, even in church, we split everyone based on age group, and church historically was not that way. Church was always everyone's together. And John Dewey, because you have to understand in the 20s and 30s, America was all about the science, right? So whatever science says, that's what we're going to do. And so you have a man who's an atheist, who hates God, who comes out and says, science says.
And for the record, was the inventor of the Dewey Decimal Systems used in libraries, which are kind of passé now, but and author of the Humanist Manifesto.
Yes.
One.
Yeah.
First one or the second? First one. First Humanist Manifesto. Sorry, please continue,
Yeah,
John Dewey.
but a man who hates God.
Yep.
And the church takes his ideology of children and says, yeah, that sounds good. Because science says children need to be around children their age. So that's how they develop, which I think culturally you can see that that's been a complete mess. And it's been a mess in the church too, because it's again, we're taking worldly ideology, we're applying it to God's system, which has always been all believers gathering. And it's not that we can never have groups, but the main gathering should be the focus. And so what's end up happening is we grow in a subset of church, whether in children's church, then the youth group. Mm-hmm. We're never part of church. And we've only ever been friends with people our age. Now, it's not just our fault in a sense, because what I see too with the older generation is they don't go out of their way to befriend young people. And they just say, well, it's the young person's fault. In fact, it always makes me laugh when people in church will say, because I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they'll say, well, your kid doesn't like me because they don't come up to me. Well, it's like, well, my kid's 1 and 3. Do you expect them to show the maturity that you have? Maybe if you go up to them, they'll attach to you.
They may follow the example.
Yeah. And so what I've noticed is what older people have to do is they need to find young people to attach themselves to. And what young people need to do is realize, I need older people. Mm-hmm. And then you see this with David and Jonathan. Jonathan is probably, 20, 30 years older than David. Mm-hmm. And it's always presented in Sunday school like they're teen best buds.
Yeah, right, right.
Like they're the same age.
BFFs.
Yeah, and that's not true. Yeah. Jonathan's much older than David. The disservice we have in how we read scriptures, we see those narratives right by each other with Jonathan, right, going and claiming the garrison of the Philistines, and then David kills Goliath. In reality, there's years between those narrative accounts because it's showing why Jonathan attaches himself to David, right? He sees the same faith.
Right.
So Jonathan doesn't just invest in him spiritually, he invests in him physically, he invests in him emotionally, he invests in him in all sorts of ways where their souls are intertwined. Same reason, and I don't mean this as a disservice to others in my church, when Dave Simpson dies, I will probably cry a lot. Sure. And I cry when anyone dies in our church.
All right.
But it'll just be different. Because there's a closeness there. Not that I'm not close with others, but you can't be super close with everyone. It's not humanly possible.
No, you're right.
But at the same point, people in my generation need to stop making the excuse, well, there's no one my age. Because if that's the case, there will not be a church.
It's funny that you went to David and Jonathan, because I was thinking about the story where Solomon took over. Was it Solomon or was it Rehoboam?
Rehoboam does, yeah, and he listens to his friends.
And he listens to his friends. He says, he goes to the elders and he says, how would you tell me to answer the people? And then he goes to his friends and they say, tell him that your father
he
whipped you with whips, and we'll whip you with scorpions.
Yeah.
That's a fine example. So how? Okay. So because what you're talking about is multi-generational Christianity.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea is that we don't nurture. Again, to go back, weirdly that we're using Solomon's carriage. I've never done this before in this podcast, but we're talking about Solomon's carriage, and you're saying that we've got to be mindful of those in front, mindful of those on the side, mindful of those in the rear. Mm-hmm. And I think you're onto something. How do we fix that then in your mind? How do we get the generations to talk?
I think some of it is you have to teach it. And it probably starts with teaching the older people, because my generation, and I don't know, I grew up maybe in a hybrid. I was born in the 90s, so I'm not on my phone as much as some of my generation. There is this kind of weird split depending on where your siblings fall.
Interesting.
I'm the youngest of 5. And so all my siblings are early 90s or 80s.
So hold on. You have 4 siblings?
Yes, yeah.
That's a great start.
Yeah, great start, yeah. Yeah, I'm 2 on the way, in the sense of I got 2 right now. There's not twins, I guess, but yeah.
I'm sorry. I derailed you.
Yeah, but so with having being the youngest of 5, right, with some of them being in the 80s, some of them being in the 90s, I grew up watching all 80s things.
Right.
My wife, on the other hand, she's the 3rd child. All her siblings are born in the 90s. So she watched 90s and 2000s things. And so even generationally, we have just different things about us. And even when we went to college, I'm not a phone person. I don't like texting. I'd much rather call someone or talk to them face to face, which is weird in my generation. My wife would rather text. But even when we went to college, you'd see couples and they wouldn't talk to each other face to face. They would text each other.
Right.
And they're sitting right by each other. And it's like, man, it's going to work out great for your marriage. And that's how they were starting their relationship and how they communicate. And this generation's very much that way, where they're not going to initiate communication because they're already uncomfortable even looking at someone in the eye.
Right.
They've never talked to someone face to face. They sit in a screen all day. So the older generation has to make it their mission to really do what Christ did and pursue, right? To love first, to seek first, to do all the things that Christ does first. And really, in Christianity, that's just true in general. If someone's not pursuing you, pursue them. If someone's not showing love to you, show love to them, right? That's always the exemplification of character of Christ, where we see that he always does things first. And so there's no excuse for any Christian and say, well, no one's doing it for me. Well, the reality is you should be the initiator, right? And so I think it is on the responsibility of the older, because they should be the more mature. And you don't always see that. It always makes me laugh. I'm 29, and I have to be more mature than sometimes people who are double or triple my age, because that's the expectation, because you're the pastor.
That's right.
But it just kind of makes me chuckle, because it's like, I mean, it's been 30, 40 years of you being a believer. Let's get this down, right? And don't get me wrong, God works us all at different points and in different ways. So there's no reason to bash them for that. But
and I think that there's also generational, as I said earlier, generational blind spots that, it is incredibly difficult for me to understand what it's like to be 20. I remember being 20, but the world has changed so much since 1987 when I was 20.
Yeah.
That I don't recognize it. I couldn't recognize it I don't think I would recognize it as a 20-year-old.
Yeah.
What challenges do you face being so young?
I think one of the main challenges, and I don't mean this, my church does a really good job, but I do think that because I'm young, people respect me to an extent, but it only goes so far. Because I'm young. And I think that's why Paul tells Timothy, don't let anyone despise your youth. Yeah, just because you're young does not mean that you're stupid.
Right.
And does not mean that you aren't an authority in that sense, in a pastoral sense. And it's not that God's people should ever be lorded over or abused. But if someone's speaking truth, it doesn't matter what their age is. And sometimes that is a block when you're young, because it's Josh is only 29. And so because of that, I do feel pressure at times where I feel like people are trying to push me around, right? Because it's we can push him whatever direction because he's young.
Just a kid.
Yeah. He's impressionable.
I've got socks older than him.
Yeah, socks older than him, yeah. Where they just want to kind of push their way. And that's just true of anyone. You always have that in church. But I do feel that a lot as a younger pastor that people, I think, try harder to do that because they think, well, he's young people are timid, maybe I can get my way. Yeah. And I do feel that pressure at times. And I would say the majority of our church does a wonderful job. They don't treat me that way. But every now and then, people don't always put on the hat of maturity. And sometimes people, they just want their way. And that's true of all of us, which is one of the reasons Paul tells Titus. He says the pastor can't be self-willed, and often it's translated arrogant, but it literally means not your way, because it's not what it's about. It's not about the pastor having his way. It's about pastor doing what does God say? What does God desire in the situation? And it should never be about what do I want. And even in church, that's why James says the meekness or the wisdom that is from above is first meek and then peaceable. Or maybe he says peaceable then meek. It's one of the, whatever order it is, but it is kind of an order, right? It's not about having my way. It's about having unity, even if I don't have my way.
It's funny that you would never expect a shepherd to throw a temper tantrum with a sheep.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I can, but that doesn't mitigate the frustration. Like, so we've had sheep and goats both. And I'm here to tell you, sheep are stupid.
Yeah.
It's not a compliment when Jesus tells us that we're sheep. Sheep can be some of the most frustrating animals I've ever met.
Yeah, I often tell people God compares us to sheep, and sheep are stupid. So imagine what God thinks of you.
That's right. Yeah. That's funny. So you are in the middle of starting your doctorate. Tell me where you are.
So there's 3 phases to the doctorate I'm doing. So I'm doing a PhD in Bible exposition at Liberty right now, and it's been very beneficial. But the first phase, I kind of classed out of most of it just from getting my master's already. Doing a lot of the language stuff there. So the first phase was a bunch about language stuff, so Greek and Hebrew and things like that. And thankfully, I already had a lot of that. And so I only had to do an introductory class and one other introduction class. And then I was able to move on to phase 2, which was essentially, here's major interpretive issues in the Old Testament, and then going through each section of the Old Testament, and the same with the New Testament. So they split the Old Testament into the Hebrew order, which would be the law, the prophets, and the writings, instead of what we're used to, which is law, history, poetry, major prophets, minor prophets, is what we're used to in our Bibles, right? It's just a thing of order. It has nothing to do with what's there. The content's the same. But it's just looking at it from that perspective, right? How would they have seen it? And so a big portion of that Old Testament background stuff was ancient Near Eastern literature, right? Reading things that help you understand why the biblical authors said things the way they did. For example, they'll often use what's called a polemic. A polemic is a teaching method to use what's in a culture to speak against it, or to adopt things from it to show something else. So in the Baal cycle, right, which a lot of these things have only been discovered in the past 50, 60 years, which is it's just amazing, the information and things that have been discovered, which is why you can't blame your pastor for not telling you, because a lot of them just don't know. They've not been taught. We were talking earlier about how we both have an affinity for Michael Heiser.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one of the things that he mentioned near the end of his life, is people were getting frustrated while my pastor's holding back from me. And you have to realize that a lot of these men either weren't taught that, or they went to seminary at a time where those things were not being taught because they were just recently discovered. And what you'll find, too, is that when people finish their degrees, they stop reading. They finish the information. That's all there is to know. And that's not true. Anything education teaches you is there's more to learn. But a lot of education is people become good parrots. They don't become good thinkers. They're just good at repeating everything they've heard. And so one of the benefits of increasing education is you learn how little you know, and gives you a desire to say, okay, I'm going to keep learning instead of just parroting information. And so with that, though, the Baal cycle shows how Baal is called the rider on the clouds, right? He's the storm cloud rider.
Okay. So
right. And so even tonight we sang.
You're talking about the god.
Yeah, the god Baal.
Baal.
Yeah.
Baal.
Yeah,
okay.
Baal, Baal.
Yep, I'm with you.
And so
the ancient Mesopotamian
the ancient
deities. And
Mesopotamian deities, right? He's one of the chief Canaanite gods.
Yep.
And so what you'll find with him is that he's called the rider on the clouds, which we sang that tonight with Days of Elijah, right? Behold, he comes riding on the clouds, right? Because God takes that idea, where usually if you read stuff, they'll call it a motif, which is just a fancy word for theme or idea. And so they'll take that and they'll apply it to Jehovah or Yahweh to say, no, he's not this chief being. Yahweh and Jehovah is.
Right.
And so you can't say he's the rider on the clouds. Our God's the rider of the clouds. And it would speak to that culture to say, oh, your God's this God. That's why it's amazing when you get to Joshua, right? And Rahab says, your God is the God of heaven above and on the earth and beneath the earth. Because she's admitting he is the only God. There are no other gods. It's a statement of not just monotheism. It's a statement to say all these gods I've been worshiping in Canaan are no longer real. Your God is the supreme God. He defeats them all. And you'll see the same thing even in 1 Samuel, right? When they capture the ark and they bring it into the house of Dagon.
Yep.
And it's funny because initially, right, Dagon falls before the ark, right? Because again, who's king? Yahweh's king, Jehovah's king.
Right.
And then they come back the next day after they set it up, and his head and his hands are cut off. Because it's not just that Yahweh and Jehovah's king. Now he's killed Dagon for daring to stand in his presence. Because you see that Samuel does the same thing to a king later in the book, right? He does it to Agag. Because you'll see this repetitiveness throughout the book, right? Jehovah exercises his authority over false gods by killing them. They no longer exist. And that's not to say that these things ever existed, right? The Bible says the gods of the nations are demons, right? You see it in Deuteronomy. You see it repeated in the New Testament as well by Paul. And so you see that idea that God has exercised authority over them. These nations are worshiping things that cannot help them. And then, right, with King Agag, Samuel repeats the same thing when Saul refused to do what God said. So Samuel comes and he hews Agag into pieces. And that's the same idea, right? Chopping him up because now Agag is dead. And the whole point is that kingdom is now conquered, which is why they would not dare to cross the threshold, because now that's now Yahweh's place. It's his territory. He now owns
territory,
it.
Yeah, whole thing, yeah.
Yeah, he now owns it. And so learning that background information helps so much when you read the rest of the Bible, because it explains, okay, why are they saying these things? It's not that they're just trying to describe God, although that's a good thing. They're trying to say God is the God of gods. He is the only God, right? It's the New Testament. He's the King of kings, Lord of lords. There's no one above him. And anything you could say about your God that's high and mighty, really it applies to our God, and your God's nothing. And so that was such a helpful background to go into that with the rest of the books, not because the Bible's lacking something, right? The Bible's still sufficient on its own, but understanding culture, it's like seeing a picture in black and white versus in color, right? It's not that you can't see the picture, but it adds so much more detail to the picture. It makes so much more sense.
We were in Tennessee this last 2 points, and I'm fixing to try to tee you up. We were with the Isaacs on Monday for a Memorial Day concert, and they sang a song. Somebody sang a song. It wasn't the Isaacs, somebody else. Called "You Should Have Seen It in Color," and it's talking about the pictures of the grandparents in World War II, and the grandfather telling the grandson, "Boy, if you think I look scared there, you should have seen it in color."
I grew up in the generation that thought color wasn't invented until the 1970s, that the world was black and white beforehand.
Right.
Because,
yes, it absolutely was.
Because they just told us color was invented in 1970.
That's right.
So as a 6 and 7-year-old, it's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe, when did everything become color?
Yeah.
Right, not realizing that it was just television.
It happened about 20 minutes into The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden the world changed.
That's right. Yeah, and the whole world changed. Okay, so I feel like we need to back up a little bit, because this audience is not going to be aware of Michael Heiser, and I don't want to go down the crazy rabbit holes.
Yeah.
Even though I would love to, it would just take us so long. But I want you to sort of hit the 30,000 foot level, and maybe even talk specifically about Elohim.
Yeah. Well, first off, I'll start by at least saying who Michael Heiser is for people. He was a biblical scholar who was majored in Old Testament, and he was willing to go wherever the text took him. And that was the big thing for him. What does the text say? Which should matter to all of us, right? If it's sola scriptura, it's scripture alone, it matters what the Bible says.
Yep.
And so for him, he got to Psalm 82 and other places and realized the text said something different than what he initially understood. And even when I first started listening to Michael Heiser, I would get very uncomfortable and think, that's not what I heard growing up. I can't think that. So I would take it with a grain of salt. I liked a lot of the things he said, but I was really skeptical at first because, well, that's a lot different than what I've been taught.
It's a lot to chew off in one
at one moment. And he's not a crazy man.
Nope.
He loved the Lord. He died last year of pancreatic cancer. And everything that he's done has been so beneficial. He was a in-residence scholar at Logos Bible Software, for those of you that maybe use Logos. So he did a lot of the infographics and a lot of the different sets of information that you find within that. And so just a very intelligent man, loved the Lord. But he focused on how Elohim in the Old Testament did not just speak of God, because again, you have to understand that words have a range of meaning in languages, right? They don't mean the same things that we always mean. When we say God, we mean one being, that's it, no one else, nothing else exists. Again, in the Old Testament, when you see Elohim, Elohim's used of angels. Yep. It's used of dead spirits, right? Samuel, right? Saul goes because
to the witch
God's not answering him anymore. He's not getting information from God, so he goes to a witch to practice in the ancient Near East what is necromancy, right? I'm going to call up a dead person and practice divination, which is what he's doing, right? Two things that God says do not do. Don't practice necromancy, don't divine, right? It's okay to go to God for information, but you don't go to these things for information. And so with this, he goes, and the Bible says of Samuel, right, an Elohim came up out of the earth. Well, that is actually Samuel in the context, right? It's not God, it's Samuel, right? God, for whatever reason, allows Samuel to appear, right? God's still sovereign over all things. So he allows Samuel to appear, but he's defined as an Elohim. Angels are called Elohim. Go ahead.
I want to stop here and just insert a parenthetical statement, and I want you to keep going. because I think a lot of people may make the mistake that I did, which was to ascribe to Yahweh the proper name, Elohim.
Yeah.
Instead of, as Heiser, and I think the Old Testament uses the word, as more like a job description.
Yeah, it's more qualitative in a sense. Right, it doesn't have the sense of divinity to it. Right, we would understand that God is divine. There is no other gods.
Right.
Compared to his divinity. Right, but that does not mean that there are not other spiritual beings that are considered mighty. In fact, that's why you'll find Elohim sometimes is translated mighty ones.
Right.
Because it does have this symbol of strength to it. In fact, that's why God's name is often in the plural. Again, yes, I believe in a Trinity, but Elohim is this idea of a majestic plural. It's why the Queen of England, or I guess the King now, King Charles, right, he'll say we when he means I, right? It's a majestic plural. It's a way to say, I'm so grand, I don't just talk about myself in the singular, I talk about myself in the plural. And so God doesn't use just El, he'll say Elohim, right, to speak of his grandeur, right? He is king of everything, so he has the right to do that.
Yep.
But it's also used collectively of false gods, right? You'll see that if it's a group of false gods, they'll be called Elohim, which obviously they're not the one true God.
Right.
It's used, again, of angels, fallen angels, dead spirits of humans. And so, again, it seems to have a spiritual quality to it, right? Where it deals with those that are spirits, not so much dealing with those that are divine.
Yep.
And so that's a better way of looking at it than just assuming Elohim's a proper name, because it's really not. It's dealing with, right, what these things are, right? God is a spirit. Well, and if we die, right, we're separated from our body.
Right.
So we are then a spirit. And so you do see that sense taken throughout Scripture.
And for more on that, if you're interested, Mike Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, is an academic work, and he had another one that was like a layperson's without the footnotes, and I forget the name of it. Maybe
I'm not sure.
Angels and Demons or something.
Angels and Demons might be the lesser work.
Yeah.
Unseen Realm he still kind of reformatted it though to be more on a lay level. He didn't just publish, because it was his dissertation. I think part of it was he didn't just publish his dissertation. He reworked it for the common person to make it understandable.
Right.
Yeah.
I only meant that it's a scholarly work in that it has tons of citations.
Which by the way, if you read something with citations, because at least you know that they actually read something and check them.
Yep.
One of the worst things I found out in like the 1980s, right, and it had to do with, of course, back in the 80s there was a huge thing over, right, King James versus other translations in the 70s and 80s, and James White, I actually watched a 2-hour thing with him back on there used to be a lot of Christian TV stations and shows back then,
right?
But it was an actual talk show. It was like a 2-hour thing between, the guy that was on the chair of the New American Standard, who I think he's still on the chair for the 2020 revision and other things as well, and a bunch of the guys on the King James side. Now, I think I've told you, just by my own upbringing conviction, I still use the King James. I don't have people who don't. So I'm not bashing it.
Right.
It's something that I understand because I grew up in it. But it's all interesting because essentially with the debate itself, you see that one of the main books that was cited, it's called New Age Versions, right? It was written by, I don't remember the lady's name, but it turned out half of the footnotes, half of the bibliography was false. And you had pastors for 15 years who, to use it as a tool, just stood up and said, right, oh, look, we found these things, these stories, and right, someone in the New American Standard Committee, or maybe it was ASV, I think it was the ASV originally, right? They finished the translation and God killed them, and see, God hates this, and people were canting at their death, and right, Westcott and Hort being involved in things that they really couldn't prove, because it turned out all these stories were based on a false bibliography, false citations, and people held it up, oh, it's a scholarly work. Don't just trust something that you read. Go check the citations, go check the bibliography, because people can misrepresent what someone says.
It's the Berean mindset.
Yeah, it's the Berean mindset. And if you're curious, people misrepresent people say, just go watch the news, right? You can watch news clips all the time where people take stuff out of context and twist it. And that same thing can be done in academia, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ministry on the Move. I've been your host, Chris McNeil. For more information on the McNeils, you can find us at mcneilmusic.tv. Write me at chris@mcneilmusic.com. We would love it if you would help get the word out, spread the word by writing us a review on iTunes or YouTube or Spotify or wherever it is that you consume this podcast. It would be a great help to us. Join us next time for the conclusion of this two-part interview with Josh. Thanks so much for listening. God bless you. Someone recently wrote in and asked where I kept all of my dad jokes. And so I thought I'd let you guys know that I do keep them in a very secure database.